Welcome everyone to this very special event hosted by the Transnational Legal History Group, part of the Center for Comparative and Transnational Law here at CUHK Law. Today's seminar will involve the presentation and discussion of David Veevers' The Origins of the British Empire in Asia, 1600 to 1750. Dr. Veevers is a Leverhulme Trust Early Career Fellow at the School of History at Queen Mary University of London. And we are immensely fortunate to have him with us here today. By way of brief summary, the book itself provides an important revisionist account of the origins of the British Empire in Asia in the early modern period, including by uncovering a hidden world of transcultural interactions between servants of the English East India Company and the Asian communities and states they came into contact with, revealing how it was this integration of Europeans into non-European economies, states, and societies, which was central to British imperial and commercial success, rather than national or mercantilist enterprise. And leading along the way to an East India Company which gradually became enfranchised with a breadth of privileges and rights, from governing sprawling metropolises to trading customs free. Overarchingly, in emphasizing the Asian genesis of the British Empire, the book sheds new light on the foreign frameworks of power which fueled the expansion of global Britain in the early modern world. So that's the book itself. For those who haven't read the book, I couldn't possibly recommend it enough. It combines the virtues of careful, tireless research with wide-angled reflections on broader matters of political, legal, and historical concern, and as such is not only deeply informative and instructive in its own right, but also provides a great deal of inspiration and food for thought, opening the gates, as it were, to many further areas of productive reflection and research. So in terms of the format for today, Dr. Veevers will speak for around 45 minutes. After that, we will open the floor to questions and discussion. If you have any questions during the talk, please send them in to me using the chat feature on Zoom, and I will then read them out or possibly simply unmute you so you can read the question yourself during the question and answer session. The aim of this seminar, as all of our seminars, is of course very much to generate as much discussion and interaction as possible. So please do send in any questions you might have. Let me also note, it's quite typical in hosting these sorts of events that people, the questions really tend to start flowing when we have 10 or 5 minutes left. And obviously then we tend to quickly run out of time. So if you do want to ensure that we will actually get to your question, if you send it in early, the odds of that will be much greater. Finally, for everyone's information, let me note this event will be recorded and posted on the center's website within a short period of time from today. So if you want to rewatch it or share it with colleagues, you can always do so there. Okay, so without further ado, let me hand the floor over to Dr. Veevers.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for that introduction. That's really kind. Thanks everyone also for attending today. It's been a really weird book launch over the past sort of 9 months, obviously due to the current global situation. So it's unfortunately I haven't been able to get out there and do as many talks as I'd like. It's more me waiting in my office for people to invite me to talk. So thanks for inviting me along today. It's a real privilege to be able to talk about the book. I'm really proud of the book. I did it over a number of years whilst researching at the universities of Kent and Queen Mary here in the UK. And it was released last June to much relief from myself. So what I'd like to do in today's talk is obviously talk about the book and some of its key themes, but what I've tried also to do is ever so slightly merge this with my new project, which is more of a legal focus, looking at the sort of transnational constitutional mechanisms which governed Europe's presence in Asia. So I've sort of merged the two in, much of that is in the book itself, but these are themes I'm teasing out a bit more in my new project. So the title for today's paper, 100 Gates Open for Entrance. This is a quote from a French merchant in Bengal in the 1670s, and the full quote goes something like that Bengal has 100 gates open for entrance, but not one for exit. This idea that there are many ways that Europeans can come into India and to prosper. I've stolen this quote as a kind of analogy for the way in which the company's expansion in Asia doesn't take the more traditional route we think about European expansion as being one that was predominantly fiscal or military. And there are multiple paths to expansion, which is really what my paper is about, the expansion of the East India Company within the frameworks of Asian power in the 17th and early 18th century. So welcome all today, and thank you. I look forward to your questions as well. And you just have to bear with me with my fantastic PowerPoint skills, which are which I'm dusting off and have done this past year. So the book is predominantly concerned with a new conceptualization of the Anglo-British presence in Asia in the 17th and 18th centuries. And doing my research, I discovered that, the field there's been a complacent consensus for far too many decades that rests on, what I would describe as a theological understanding of the British Empire, one that sort of, with an eye on the future of British domination, looks back to this earlier period and conceptualizes the British as always being very capable actors, very powerful. And really, that's not the case. There's a very long century and a half of the English in Asia before the big territorial conquest at the end of the 18th century, which, is a long period of failure, of weakness, of a scrambling to find alternative strategies to the sort of nationalist, mercantilist principles and initiatives which, the Portuguese, the Spanish, even the Dutch have more success with than indeed the English do. Nonetheless, by the mid-18th century, the British have emerged in Asia as the most successful European presence, governing large cities, heavily fortified, enjoying customs-free trade, becoming the biggest trader in Asian goods. And so really the book was conceived to answer, what strategies did the British develop or adopt to accommodate their weakness and therefore transform their position? They're not operating from a position of strength, they're operating from a position of weakness. And yet by the end of this period, they have emerged more successful than other Europeans. So how do we conceptualize that framework of expansion? One that is not predominantly fiscal or military until much later in this period. That's the central theme of my book. But before I tease those out and I go into some more detail, because it's a work of revisionism, which is something obviously we should always defend in making that that claim. I'd like to set up the sort of challenges and the barriers that my book sought to challenge in providing this kind of alternative interpretation to the English experience in Asia. So for one, really, my work discovered that previous histories of the British, the origins of the British Empire in Asia, were too reliant on the role of the English and later British nation state. Traditional ideas of state building processes in early modern Western Europe obviously are those that often gravitate towards the centralization and institutionalization of political authority, national resources, and also the use or the monopoly of use of violence. And these have been put forward by historians over the past few decades, from Tilley and Ertmann, and before then by John Brewer as well. And they've tended to kind of consequently lead to an inflation of the role of the nation state in subsequent overseas expansion. And what we often get with these state-centric narratives are histories in which European overseas expansion is the natural product of the expansion of the European state system itself, whether that's fiscally, militarily, technologically, or even ideologically. And these criteria have been influential in shaping the parameters by which we understand the capabilities of the state in which Europe supposedly achieved some kind of superiority or dominance in this period. And, you know, to be fair, much of this has kind of been held up by the rather astonishing colonization of the Spanish and the Portuguese in the Atlantic, in which there was a sizable role played by both the Spanish and the Portuguese crowns in that process. So for state-centric narratives of the British Empire, colonialism is very much a continuation of the state-making process. The other sort of main challenge that I wanted to attack was the idea that then, therefore, the overseas arms of these nation states, the trading companies, were somehow centralized institutions capable of projecting a kind of coherent force in the non-European world. Certainly for the North European experience, the East India companies of, for example, England and the Netherlands are often depicted as effective arms of this extra European state enterprise, you know, applying lethal maritime force and superior capital organization to aggressively monopolize Asia's markets and conquer its most productive and fertile regions. And, you know, all we need to do is point to the Dutch colonization of archipelago Southeast Asia from the mid-17th century, or indeed even the English conquests of the North Indian Gangetic Plain at the end of the 18th century. Despite the fact that these East India companies, however, were more sort of a collective of private interests, transformed into a corporate body by a royal charter, historians have nonetheless insisted on ascribing to the East India Company a kind of cohesive, hierarchical, institutional structure capable of assembling kind of vast regulatory regimes of social, legal, economic, and cultural power over distance of often thousands of miles. And the East India Companies, what I would sort of term their metropolitan authorities, and that is everything from, you know, the board of directors in London to the court of shareholders, the Crown, and indeed even Parliament. They're often placed in the driving seat of the East India Company's development in Asia. And again, to be fair, the company's powers were partly reliant on Crown charters, its trade on shareholder investment, its regulatory framework on parliamentary intervention, and that's especially the case in the 18th century. And anyone who's done any research, for example, in the British Library, knows that there are endless leather-bound tomes of commands and orders dispatched by the directors to their servants and factories in Asia, covering almost every aspect of their operations. But even when historians have conceded to the company a degree of autonomy from its domestic European setting, and I'm thinking here probably of Philip Stern's work on the company state, the idea that trading companies enjoy their own state-like powers. Nonetheless, they've remained overwhelmingly embedded within their domestic European context and understood overwhelmingly as being shaped by the ideas, the interests, and the policies of their domicile nation states. And really the most significant consequence of this approach is that, I mean, historians look to the legal and political mechanisms and frameworks developed in Europe to understand the company's subsequent development in Asia. And let me give you one example of this is probably the English Crown Charter, which has really come to occupy a sacrosanct place in the company's development. You know, Crown Charters regulated everything from the company's ability to export bullion out of England, to raise taxes in its settlements, even to wage war and to exercise civil and criminal powers over the subjects within their jurisdictions. And a good example of this is if we think about interloping, for example. Now, the company's charter granted it a monopoly over all trade east of the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa. And those who entered the waters of the Indian Ocean without the permission of the East India Company were deemed to be interlopers and could be seized and sent back to Europe and then prosecuted in English courts. Now, the emergence of interlopers in sizable numbers in the late 17th century is often attributed to the refusal of the Crown to renew the company's charter, allowing it to lapse and then open Asia up to a flood of English interlopers. On the other hand, the eventual suppression of the interlopers at the end of the 17th century is attributed to a new charter which gave the company wide-ranging powers to to suppress interloping in various legal and diplomatic ways. Now, it doesn't, in many ways, it doesn't seem to matter that the moment an English subject sailed round the Cape of Good Hope and entered the jurisdiction of an Asian sovereign state, a charter from an English monarch thousands of miles away meant almost nothing at all. The company may have been given a monopoly over trade by an English monarch, but that didn't prevent Asian rulers or their elites from welcoming English interlopers with open arms and setting them up with their own commercial and jurisdictional monopolies and rights in their particular territories, and therefore attracting ever more numbers of interlopers from England looking to seize on these opportunities. And nor does it, and it also very much kind of ignores the fact that the suppression of interlopers was really more about the company having to negotiate treaties with Asian rulers that benefited them more than the company, and only then were they willing to exclude interlopers from their territories and suppress interloping trade. So the rise and fall of interlopers is just a small example of how, in understanding the company's development by looking to Europe, historians have more or less ignored the far more decisive and profound Asian context and the diplomatic, political and legal mechanisms and frameworks of these local contexts, which govern the company's development, I would argue, in far more significant ways. So, much of the previous scholarship, briefly to summarise then, on Britain's presence in Asia in the 17th and 18th centuries has rested on well-entrenched narratives of a capable and active nation state pursuing its interests through a well-regulated corporate institution like the East India Company. And because of this, our understanding of the framework of interaction between Europeans and Asians before the later 18th century has predictably been one that is antagonistic at best. Now, Sanjay Subrahmanayam, that sort of titan of this field, described the relationship between Europeans and Asians in the period 1600 to 1750 as, quote, long years of an uneasy jousting, of a jockeying for position when no single party entirely gained the upper hand, end quote. So this idea of a century and a half of contained conflict, as Subrahmanayam has conceptualized it, fits really well with some European enterprises in specific areas of Asia at this time. I'm probably thinking the Portuguese in the Western Indian Ocean region or the Dutch on the island of Sumatra. But it's not very demonstrative of the English experience in Asia during this period. Had the company even wanted to dominate Asian states, it entirely lacked the power to jostle with even the smallest Asian polities it encountered, let alone a superpower like the Mughal Empire. So this idea of being locked in a struggle for dominance doesn't really reflect the history of the East India Company across that century and a half. Now, part of the problem of understanding the relationship between the company and the Asian states it interacted with is, in this earlier period, the term, it very narrows this concept of expansion to a fiscal military process, right? Which European success is seen almost exclusively in terms of a projection of force or the superior concentration and mobilization of resources over Asian states and their elites. That's how we traditionally think of European expansion. And the enforcement of trading monopolies, an increase of territory, the superiority of maritime resources are all hallmarks of European expansion, which supposedly demonstrates the exercise of European and English power over the Asian world. And because of this very traditional conceptualization of expansion, one that is stubbornly entrenched in our narratives, as something that was predominantly extraterritorial, of Europeans forces operating outside of and then against Asian state structures. And we're led to believe that a flourishing European presence was mutually exclusive to a stable and strong Asian state. And in fact, it's often the former which is invoked in undermining the latter, the growth of European presence undermining the stability of an Asian state. An expansive European presence could only be realized at the expense of Asian rulers and their communities. Yet again, coming back to my earlier point, this ascribes to the English East India Company too much agency and power in shaping the Asian environments around them in this earlier period, at a time when it had very little resources, operated thousands of miles from home, and was interacting with the world's, the early modern world's superpowers in the Indian Ocean. And leaning on these kinds of perspectives and conceptualizations really erases the agency and power of those Asian states and communities the company found itself amongst. And it flattens local context into sort of hazy, passive backdrops to eventual English success. By the later 18th century, the expansion of the company's fiscal and military resources did destabilize the Asian environments it operated in. But for much of the 17th and earlier 18th century, the English presence was too marginal to have this kind of decisive impact. Now, previous research has also more recently swung in the other direction, to argue that a flourishing Asian state was mutually exclusive of a stable and strong European presence. And I'm thinking here of East Asia, of course, where the power of the Tokugawa shogunate or Ming Dynasty China was almost absolute, and European communities were completely contained by Asian regulatory frameworks and stripped of all agency to the point of exclusion. If you think of the Canton system, which is only formalized in the later 18th century, but informally operates for much of this period. And in Japan, of course, Europeans were eventually completely excluded, all but the Dutch East India Company, who were confined to an artificial island. And stripped of all their major commercial and extraterritorial privileges over time. Yet again, swinging too far the other way, stripping Europeans and the English East India Company specifically of all power in their interactions with Asian states, and boiling it down to this idea of being completely contained, again, is not demonstrative or reflective of the English experience over this century and a half. While it more accurately represents the weakness of the English company in the face of Indian strength, it fails to explain how the company ended up with a sweeping package of rights and powers, despite its very submissive stance towards Asian states. Right, so I've justified, I may be justifying that more to myself than to you guys, but I've justified why we need this revisionist history. We've got a very kind of unsatisfactory state of the field, which on the one hand ascribes too much power and agency to the English in Asia at this time, but on the other hand, in stripping them of all their power, fails to explain how they emerge by the mid-18th century as the leading European power. What strategies, how can we conceptualize a kind of expansion that is not a projection of force over Asian states or communities? This is where my book comes in, The Origins of the British Empire in Asia. It really is a history of understanding British expansion, not as something that was extraterritorial, not as something that was projected against or at the expense of existing Asian states and societies, but rather something that happened within the Asian state system. That the English expansion grew under the carapace of powerful Asian empires and states in this period. So to give you a brief overview of the book, and then I want to break it down to hopefully the three major contributions my books made to the field. To revise the kind of untenable narratives that I've been talking about over the sort of past 10 or 15 minutes, what I did is I situated my book at the confluence of two converging, yet rather frustratingly entirely segregated historiographies. Those of state and empire formation in Europe on the one hand, and state and empire formation in Asia on the other. And in recent decades, I found that these two historiographies, these two schools of thoughts have moved very much in the same direction, and yet they rarely ever talk to one another. And by integrating these predominantly European and Asian schools of thoughts, my book was able to go beyond the rather dichotomous understanding of Europeans and Asia as powerful or as weak. And instead reveal the ways in which the expansion of the company in the 17th and early 18th centuries was largely the result of its long integration into existing political and economic frameworks of power in Asia. We can't understand the expansion of the English East India Company without placing it appropriately within the context of the expansion of certain states and empires in Asia itself. These things weren't often happening separately and in parallel, but were happening together, bound up as a single process. That is to say, my book, and this could probably be the tagline of the book, really, is a study of the Asian genesis, the Asian perspective of the British Empire, and the Asian elites and structures and forces which transformed and reshaped the company from, as I'll describe in a minute, a failed English corporation desperately trying to project English national interests abroad, into a commercial and political hybrid which straddled both Europe and Asia, as much a vassal of powerful Asian states as an arm of the English crown. So what happens to these narratives when we flip that perspective and we look at it from the perspective of the Asian state and empire formation process? And to do that, I make three key arguments, and they are as follows. Number one, the early modern state and empire formation process was a highly decentralized one, which relied on the integration and enfranchisement, and that's really important, not just incorporating and subduing, but also enfranchising a range of subordinate actors as a way to actualize state and imperial power. And I'm talking here both of in Europe and Asia, although Asia is obviously my focus. This allowed the East India Company to sort of nimbly insert itself simultaneously within English and Asian frameworks of political and economic power. And by subordinating itself politically to Asian sovereign systems and in upholding local Asian power structures, the company was rewarded with commercial and jurisdictional powers that dramatically transformed its presence. This in turn allowed the company to increase its trade and therefore retain the support and resources of its domestic English stakeholders. So it's a high wire, delicate balancing act that the company didn't always get right, but across a century and a half paid off massively. So my book looks at empire formation, European and Asian, as a decentered process. Secondly, I look in detail at this idea of the key mechanisms through which the English East India Company became integrated into pre-existing Asian frameworks of power was predominantly not at the national level or even the corporate level, but instead at the private level. The private networks that individual East India Company servants forged. And they pursued a range of strategies to integrate themselves into their local Asian surroundings, including marriage into elite Asian and mestizo or mixed race families, establishment of expansive Anglo-Asian kinship networks, the acquisition of cultural patronage from local Asian elites, and the formation of highly lucrative business partnerships with Asian merchants, the last one being the area that's probably attracted most research by historians of this field. In total, these efforts gave individual company servants, and by extension, their corporate employers, often incidentally, access to local sources of political, economic, cultural, and diplomatic capital, which firmly entrenched the company into its local surroundings, whether willingly or unwillingly. So looking at the formation of empires and states as the enfranchisement of private networks. And then third and finally, the East India Companies, and this is the area I think which will appeal most to the audience in front of me today, the English East India Company's integration into certain states and empires in Asia led to the emergence of a range of legal and diplomatic and, dare I say, even constitutional, although that third one's become a bit contentious, I found, a range of legal, diplomatic and constitutional mechanisms which governed and regulated their position within official and local Asian hierarchies and systems of power. The East India Company had to acquire and maintain a complex package of rights from their Asian hosts to operate within their jurisdictions. And these regulated absolutely everything from the size of the East India Company settlements to the ability to build fortifications and what material they could build those forts in and how high those fort battlements could be, and to whether or not they were allowed legally to build ships in Asia. Even the political economy of the company's trade. The company was a monopolistic operation because of its grant of a crown charter in Europe. But that wasn't the case in Asia. Its political economy was shaped by the political economy of the Asian states it operated within. And what the company could and couldn't do in regards to its monopoly was entirely dependent on those mechanisms. And of course, the judicial authority that the company were able to exercise over their subjects, all of these were regulated by various mechanisms. And even the specific obligations the East India Company owed to its Asian suzerains. So from farmans, or what we would call written charters or grants, to piktash, or the payment of tribute, even salabat, which is a phrase that means according to custom or precedent. The East India Company became a highly regulated transnational actor, which flourished within the carapace of Asian transnational imperial structures. So these are the three key themes that I've pulled out of my book, which I think would benefit from a discussion with yourselves, and hopefully something that would appeal to yourselves. The third point especially. So I'm just thinking of time, so let me move on and try and pick up the pace ever so slightly. So let's look at that first theme of my book, this idea of early modern empire and state formation as being essentially a process of decentralization. When the English surgeon, John Fryer, arrived in India in the service of the English East India Company in the 1670s, he travelled across the Sultanate of Golconda. Golconda was a Deccan state in central India, which had just recently conquered India's Coromandel coast. And yet John Fryer marvelled at the fact that despite now possessing an extensive and prosperous maritime province, the Sultanate's two most thriving ports, Madras and Pulicat, were governed by foreigners. And he wondered at how, and this is his words, quote, a potent prince, such as the Sultan of Golconda, allowed the English and Dutch companies possession of these ports. And he's asking this rhetorically, and Fryer observed how, as the Sultanate didn't have a navy of its own, and let me quote this here, quote, it is a maxim among them to commit their strongholds on the seacoast to those they can call their friends, end quote. Not only did this place the cost of maritime security squarely on the shoulders of the East India Companies, but the expensive fortifications they built there also acted as, quote, places as sure asylums of retreat for the Sultan if ever he were threatened. Now, Fryer was, whether he knew it or not, articulating an understanding of the Golconda state as a decentered construct, one which incorporated the East India Company, or both the East India Companies, into its empire formation, not as foreign merchants, but as key constituents exercising political and military roles that helped to consolidate Golconda authority in this region of its emerging empire in India. The company's reward was not only confirmation of its existing grants for the jurisdiction over Madras, one which it acquired before the Sultanate's expansion in India, but eventually a more expansive set of political and economic privileges at Madras that facilitated the company's commercial and jurisdictional expansion in that part of India. A growing strength which it then in turn used to uphold the authority of the Sultanate, as all good vassals should. And we see this when the newly launched French Compagnie des Indes, East India Company, burst on the scene of India in 1672. And they attacked and occupied the Golconda city of Saint Thomé, just a few miles down the coast from Madras. The Sultan summoned his vassals. He called on the Dutch and English East India Companies at Pulicat and Madras to join his army and help expel the French and recapture his city, which they did through a combined expedition in 1674, expelling some 3,000 French soldiers from Saint Thomé and then from India permanently. This was despite the fact that England and France had actually formed an alliance in Europe against the Dutch and would soon be at war with them in the Third Anglo-Dutch War. And the French are sort of blindsided by this. When they're besieged, they request help from the English at Madras, and they invoke the alliance they have in Europe between their kings. But the English company's governor at Madras refused to help the French, as the English East India Company explained had, quote, a strict alliance with the King of Golconda. So this kind of subordination, this integration, their incorporation by the Sultan of Golconda reconfigures these national and international alliances into something more local. And when a Dutch fleet enter Madras's sovereign waters, despite being technically at war with the English in Europe. The governor of Madras likewise let the Sultan know that, and I've got this quote here, it's a lengthy one, "The Dutch are at this time in our road, within the reach of our guns. But in respect to your highness, whose service they are now in, we give them no manner of molestation, but use them with the same civility and kindness as if they were your own people." So when Saint Thomé was retaken and the French were expelled, the Sultan rewarded the English East India Company with a new charter or farman, which granted them the right to build ships anywhere in the Sultanate's territory, a privilege which no other European power employed at that time. And as a direct result of this, Madras soon transformed into a hub of shipbuilding and shipping, and would emerge in the following decades as the most important port of the Bay of Bengal, certainly by the end of the 17th century. Now, Golconda, like many other South Asian states and empires in this period, exercised a highly divisible form of sovereignty, one that can be conceptualized like a web of clients and allies and patrons and subordinate actors who were incorporated into the Golconda state structure and then utilized or mobilized to uphold its authority and expand their own in the process. As one historian has described Golconda's neighbour to the north, the Mughal Empire, which also integrated a diverse range of foreign and domestic groups into its sprawling imperial framework. And, you know, if thinking about Afghan and Persian migrants, Rajput princes, and even African city naval powers, the Mughal Empire has been conceptualized as, quote, a spider's web, powerful when it incorporated and mobilized a network of actors who had their own locally rooted forms of political authority, end quote. So essentially, to function effectively, constructs like the Mughal Empire had to create local political, social, and economic networks of power across a range of different ethnic, religious, and cultural groups. And the English East India Company is no different. And like the Farsi, Armenian, Afghan, or Sindhi actors who were brought into the Mughal fold and then granted a series of powerful commercial and jurisdictional rights, in exchange for their ability to increase Mughal revenues, uphold imperial power, and entrench Mughal authority in the localities, so too did the English East India Company at places like Calcutta and Madras. So if the company was willing to politically subordinate itself to Asian powers like Golconda or the Mughal Empire, and recognize the ultimate sovereignty of their rulers over the company's development, then a new world of expansion was opened up to them, one that was sanctioned and facilitated and regulated by the rulers and elites of the communities they operated within. But how did the company reconcile or balance the fact that much of its expansion at places like Madras relied not on England or Europe, but on the authority of Asian sultans and emperors, and in performing its role as a good little vassal on the one hand, and on the other hand, with the demands and interests of metropolitan authorities, whether that's the English crown, company shareholders, or the many orders of the court of directors? Well, I mean, it's clear to say it's a tricky balancing act, and it's not an act of hybridity without immense tension. It's one that even sparks armed conflict and rebellion within the East India Company. And the answer really lies in the failure of the East India Company's earlier history, one that we almost never talk about. Most histories of the East India Company begin from the mid-17th century, when the company is incorporated into a permanent joint stock, and it goes from strength to strength to strength. But we're missing half a century of failure and adaptation that really shapes the rest of the history of the English East India Company. Now, the first half of the 17th century was an experimental period of the formation of an English empire overseas. I'm thinking not just in Asia, but in the Atlantic as well, with the failure of the Virginia Company, the Civil War, and the attempt to re-centralize royal power. Repeated attempts to create a centralized, coordinated overseas presence that eventually disintegrates through the inability of the English state to sustain long-distance enterprises. That characterizes the company's earliest history in Asia. In many respects, the formation of trading companies was itself a process of decentralization, right? And Jason Sharman has talked about this in his new book, that was released actually same month as mine, Outsourcing Empire, which makes the great argument that, you know, the weakness of the English state meant that it had to outsource its overseas enterprises to a range of subordinate actors. And thinking here, the Northwest Passage expeditions in the mid-16th century, the formation of the Muscovy Company, the Crown was beginning to look to its overseas enterprises in joint partnership with private capital and private actors. And that was to relieve the state of the financial, logistical, and military burden, one that it simply did not have the resources to sustain. But even with the launch of the English East India Company, sorry, jumping ahead there, in 1600, and that's perhaps the most autonomous subordinate actor yet commissioned by the English Crown, it has its own laws, obviously, and regulations. It has a monopoly over trade. It's a first joint stock corporation. You know, the state still expects the company to uphold English interests overseas in Asia by, for example, attacking Iberian shipping, exporting England's main, finding markets for England's main export, woolen cloths and textiles, and also engaging and upholding in national diplomacy. And when we look at the earliest voyages in the first decade of the 17th century, they do all that. They capture Portuguese ships. They pass on diplomatic letters from Elizabeth and James I to Asian rulers. And they try very unsuccessfully to dump vast amounts of English woolens on very disinterested Asian markets and merchants. So while the first decade realizes unimaginable profits of upwards of 400% sometimes on some of these voyages, and looked as though the English may well have claimed a stake to the lucrative Asian trade alongside powers like the Dutch and the Portuguese. Alas, that could not be sustained. By the end of the second decade of the 17th century, the East India Company had been forced to switch from woolen exports to exporting bullion, draining England of specie in exchange for the rare spices and luxurious textiles that it so desperately needed. That was very much not in the national interest. On top of that, the company was unable to compete with a number of other more dominant commercial groups, especially the Chinese, who squeezed them out of most of the key markets, especially in archipelago Southeast Asia. And then, of course, the English East India Company repeatedly found itself on the losing end of conflict with the Dutch, and much of its shipping was destroyed in the late 16 teens. So much so that the company was weakened beyond all hope, and James I, almost without the East India Company's participation, concluded a merger in which the East India Company had to join forces with the Dutch company, simply as a way to carry on existing in the Asian trade. But really the biggest problems which highlight the weakness of a state-centric approach which the English East India Company attempted to adopt in this earlier period comes really at the end of the 1620s onwards, when financial investment dries up. And part of that is due to an economic slump in Europe more generally, with a lack of liquidity and capital investment. And this means that the company struggles to finance regular fleets to Asia. In the mid-1620s, it withdraws from many of its factories, such as Hiredo in Japan, as it couldn't really afford the shipping or resources to support them anymore. The East India Company had to find a whopping £3 million sterling between 1600 and 1630 to sustain its presence in Asia. But as it entered into a period of economic depression and contraction, which would last well into the 1660s, it could no longer rely on the English state to support such a monumental effort. Now, the decline of the East India Company's trade, its failure to find markets for English goods, and its weakened position in Asia through war with the Dutch and its inability to compete, for example, with the Chinese, all combined to convince the Crown to look elsewhere for maintaining its commercial links with Asia. And from the mid-1630s, the company's charter is allowed to lapse. It's not renewed. The company's court of directors and its shareholders turn in on each other and collapse in factional fighting and struggles. And pleas from servants in Asia, who feel completely abandoned, for supplies, money, goods, shipping, all of this falls on deaf ears. Not a single ship arrives from England to Asia in 1657. And there's a quote here from one servant stationed at the Indian port of Masulipatam on the Coromandel coast. And he says, "We are so poor that we shame to think of it." This is the English presence being brought really to its lowest ebb. At Masulipatam, the English become a laughing stock, borrowing heavily from Indian merchants, unable to repay their debts, peddling old and unwanted goods, unable to mend their factory walls as they fall into disrepair. When the English go out into the streets, they're harassed by creditors, physically abused by Golconda officials, and eventually chased out of the port altogether in 1628. By the 1640s, the company's docks at Deptford and Blackwall in London are shut down and sold off. And the factories in the Persian Gulf were abandoned, with the directors ordering that, quote, all remains in each and every one of those factories and forts be sold and disposed of to the best advantage of the company. Now, with Cromwell's, Oliver Cromwell, the Lord Protector's refusal to grant the East India Company a new charter in 1657, the directors draw up a bill of sale for the Royal Exchange, and they place the East India Company up for sale for the princely sum of £14,000. All its possessions, its territorial jurisdictions, and its goods and investments and ships. That's how much 3 decades of England's presence in Asia is half a century of England's presence in Asia is worth, £14,000. So the weakening and ultimate failure of the East India Company as an arm of the state and its consequent near collapse by mid-century creates a vacuum within the East India Company in Asia, which is filled by the private interests of company servants on the spot in Asia in their local context, who largely left adrift to find their own immediate sources of commercial, financial, and cultural capital. Instead, turned to wealthy Asian patrons and elites and partners to realize their more immediate interests. And as we have seen, the local Asian political and economic structures of power, especially in India, were highly responsive to the integration of these interlocutors, who sought desperately to anchor themselves into more resilient frameworks that would enfranchise them in a way that would realize their private interests, but also those of their employers too. So in narrating this, the unraveling, the decentralization of the English East India Company, and placing it within the context of this decentralized empire formation process in India, we can see how the two start to become entwined. And so on to my next point about the role played by private networks and actors, not by nation states, not by institutional corporations, but by the individuals and their networks that seek to become enfranchised with power and determine the shape of the systems and structures they operate within in Asia. How am I doing for time? Oh dear. Right. So as trade dries up, and I know I'm painting a depressing picture, but bear with me here. As trade dries up, shipping ceases, factories and forts fall into disrepair. Leadership in London becomes gripped by faction and fighting. England slides into civil war. The monarch's beheaded. East India Company servants in Asia increasingly took matters into their own hands. And let's go back to the Coromandel coast for a good example of this. Servants, as I mentioned, have been chased out of Masulipatam, the largest port of the Coromandel coast at that time. But by 1639, they're also forced to abandon their remaining base further down the coast at a place called Armagon, where the fort started to crumble down and they couldn't afford to repair it, and their debts were threatening to completely overwhelm them. And all trade is brought to a halt due to famine in the countryside surrounding. And when no relief comes from Europe in the 1630s, not a single treasure chest. In fact, a passing East India Company ship is hijacked by the servants at Armagon, desperate to find treasure sent out from London. And they steal several chests, but there's no money in it. They gradually begin to formulate their own policies and pursue their own strategies to reverse their pitiful condition. Yes, they work for the East India Company, but they're in Asia to profit and to acquire social and political and cultural capital. These are their private interests that shape their desires. And they don't want to go down with the East India Company ship, as it were. Francis Day, the English chief of Armagon, that crumbling fort which they're getting ready to abandon, begins to cultivate relationships further south in the area around Mylapore, which is around the town or the city of Santa May, further down the Coromandel coast. And he makes repeated private trading expeditions to the textile-rich region, making at least £500 in private trade in the 2 years between 1637 and 1639. So he's a frequent visitor on his own account, private trade, engaging with the region's merchants, getting to know them and the markets and the villages around. And he also establishes a sexual relationship with a mestizo woman from the mixed race Indo-Portuguese communities which dominated the area, and dominated especially trade and exchange in the region. So as Day begins to integrate into the commercial and social landscape around Mylapore, he eventually gained access to the court of the local Nayak, or Hindu governor, and negotiated an advantageous grant for the company for possession of a town called Madras, including the right to build a fort and to trade customs free there. This was a significant concession, but as the East India Company servants themselves explained, it was also for the Nayak's benefit. This isn't a concession that they managed to wring out of the Nayak. He, in many ways, has brought the company into a subordinate tributary relationship. And even the East India Company servants describe it thus, quote, "First, he desires his country may flourish and grow rich, which he conceives it will be by drawing merchants to him. Secondly, the fort, being made strong, will be able to defend his person on occasion against his insulting neighbours. Thirdly, we are tasked with carrying his servants into the Bay of Bengal to buy him hawks, apes, parrots, and such like baubles." So at a time when the company is on the verge of collapse and gradually withdrawing from most of its factories and forts, the grant was unsanctioned, and Francis Day and his colleagues would shortly be hauled before the Court of Directors in London, charged with insubordination, as well as fraud and the conduct of private trade. Nonetheless, Day and his colleagues from Armagun forged ahead, and on their entirely own initiative resettled at Madras in 1640. Most of the English married Indian and Indo-Portuguese women, established strong ties with the local communities, and provided services for the Nayak, including importing goods for him from Bengal and lavishing him with gifts. The fort, however, was a problem, as it was a massive, massive capital investment. So the company servants utilised their new family networks, and Day and his colleague Andrew Cogan managed to gain 10,000 pagodas in loans from their mestizo or Indo-Portuguese families to finance the building of part of the new fort, which would be known as Fort St. George, while they personally, in a private capacity, financed the other part with the profits of their private trade. So we've got a literal, well, at this point, the only remaining East India Company fort in all of India, neither sanctioned by the company, they don't even know about it this time, and it's not even financed or built by the company. It's all through private enterprise and the cross-cultural networks of these company servants who have had enough and want a strong settlement that will line their pockets. Many of the company servants soon converted to Catholicism, the religion of the Indo-Portuguese in the region, and many of the Indians at Mylapore and Santa May. And they open a Catholic church at Madras. There's no Protestant church, no Anglican church, it's only Catholic. And they abolished customs taxes and an incentive to attract other Indian, especially Indian communities that were dyers and weavers in the textile trade. And of course, that all important Indo-Portuguese community to migrate there. And we know that in the first 5 years, something like 400 families from the surrounding communities do take advantage of those incentives. And it isn't long before a dynamic, productive and growing East India Company settlement, strongly fortified and patronised by the local Nayak, has emerged at Madras without the consent or participation of the company. And in fact, in the teeth of fierce resistance, even as the city grew, the directors in London, as early as 1642, demanded the whole enterprise be abandoned. It was, they declared, quote, a very indiscreet action to go about the building of such a fort when the company's stock was so small. The lack of corporate regulation or the need to toe a national line allows East India Company servants at Madras to become deeply integrated politically, commercially, and of course culturally with their surroundings. And as a result, servants there flourished. And we get a really lovely snapshot of life at Madras in this early period, with a visiting East India Company ship captain who's come straight from London to drop off some personnel. And he discovers that all of the senior servants at Madras have amassed massive private fortunes, and each of them had married an Indian or Indo-Portuguese woman and built palatial houses for them and their families in the city. At a time when the East India Company was sinking, the chief of Madras, it was said, was worth £20,000. Two of his councillors, £5,000 each, and another worth £3,000. And this is a quote from that captain, quote, "These four gentlemen are all sworn brothers, and when they perceive they may benefit themselves in any project, they pass an oath one to another to prosecute their indentments and not dissent one from another until their ends be obeyed." Now, Francis Day, the newly arrived captain, notes, quote, "Keepeth a gentlewoman by whom he hath had two children and built for them a very fair house with orchard and garden," end quote. While he was there, the captain heard a 13-gun salute boom out from Fort St. George in honour of the christening of the third Anglo-Indian child of the councillor Henry Greenhill. So Madras is thriving, but it's more Asian than English, more Catholic than Protestant, more private than public, more familial than corporate, and more global than national. It's like a Hobbesian nightmare for the East India Company. And one senior servant visiting Madras from Surat on the other side of the coast, the English East India Company's headquarters in Asia, he comes and visits Madras, and he was aghast to find that national and corporate frameworks had all entirely disintegrated. Quote, "Most men look so much to their particular as they forget the general. Nay, they forget themselves, and that they are but servants. On the contrary, they comfort themselves like petty kings." And that's a really avid description of the way these private networks have enfranchised themselves by relying on their local Asian context. While the company is failing, their servants are thriving. Another visiting official observed of another new settlement which springs up on the Coromandel coast entirely through private initiatives. And he despairs that, quote, "At the time, the house, i.e. the factory, was altogether a monster or a body without a head. Each is his own director." So a reconstitution of the East India Company has taken place by the second half of the 17th century, in which individual servants and their private networks had become enfranchised with political and economic power in Asia, driving a radical decentralization of the company as a result. When the company's domestic context finally stabilizes and the company's metropolitan authorities gradually start to reinsert themselves into this new decentralized framework, they struggle to regain control. In 1658, the long-awaited charter had finally been granted by Oliver Cromwell, incorporating the company as a permanent joint stock for the first time, providing it with long-term prospects and stability and a range of new delegated sovereign powers. And it makes the company an attractive investment again. And soon it cobbles together a massive new stock of £750,000, builds and purchases new ships, and following several more new charters from Charles II and a new round of investment, the corporate framework of the company begins to revive, and there's an attempt to re-centralize the company. But by then it's too late. And other new settlements like Madras had sprung up in the past 3 decades and become an entrenched part of the Coromandel coast, deeply embedded in local political and economic structures, drawing their legitimacy more from an Asian ruler and sustained through the patronage of local elites. Now, when metropolitan authorities such as the Crown and the Court of Directors begin to issue new regulations and orders centralising the company, such as removing Indian governors and magistrates and replacing them with English ones in their settlements, as well as clamping down on private trade entirely, the cross-cultural elite of Madras rebel. And when a new English governor is sent out to enforce these regulations and bring Madras back into the corporate and national fold, he and his administration are seized and thrown in prison in 1665 by a coalition of Indian, Indo-Portuguese and English elites of Madras, including an ex-governor. And they proceed to govern Madras as an independent power for the next 3 years. Excuse me. And only when the company send out a fleet of warships with a proclamation from Charles II for an end to the mutiny was East India Company rule restored at Madras. But rather than punish the rebels, A status quo is agreed, and the directors settled on a compromise which included the legalisation of all private trade and the restoration of all non-English officials to their positions of power in company settlements. So while the company's domestic authorities had succeeded in sort of reinserting themselves back into the development of the company in Asia, from the 1670s, they really acknowledge that the powerful role played by these private cross-cultural networks who had firmly anchored the company into their local context. The decentralization of the company was complete by the 1670s in many respects. And moving forward, we can describe the company as more of a hybrid actor, not a national or corporate English enterprise, straddling rather both English and Asian frameworks of power in a nimble, although often, as events at Madras showed, quite a contentious balancing act. And I'll give you one more example before I move on and sort of wrap up. And this is best reflected. Let's zoom in again on the Coromandel Coast, but further north to the Godavari Delta, which is the Sultanate Golconda's northern territory with neighbouring Mughal Bengal. There, from the 1670s, in 1670, we find a chap called Robert Fleetwood. He's the English chief of the company's factory there, who was also appointed the Golconda governor of the region. While stationed in the Godavari Delta, Fleetwood had married an Indo-Portuguese woman who was both the daughter of an ex-governor of Madras and also of an elite mestizo woman with strong connections to the surrounding communities. Soon, Fleetwood had established a large mixed-race family and created networks all across the region and prospered through the private trading relationships this opened up to him, creating partnerships with, amongst others, the Golconda governor of Masulipatam, his deputy, the international Mughal merchant Mir Jamal Muhammad, and several important Indo-Portuguese elites and merchants. So Robert Fleetwood begins to emerge as a significant local elite within the Godavari Delta. Fleetwood then, quote, without the advice of Madras, contracted with the king of Golconda for the right to govern Narsapur. Now, Narsapur was a prosperous shipbuilding town of 10,000 people, where the East India Company's factory was based, and also of which he was chief. So he's both the English chief and now the Golconda governor. He paid the Sultan an annual tribute of 115 pagodas, and Fleetwood both acts as the Faujdar, or the local political officer, and the tax collector over the town. And one official observed that the position gave Fleetwood, quote, possession of the territory encompassing the company's factory and the river, by which means he can ship of goods without asking leave of anyone or be stopped by them. More significantly, he was now technically the Golconda landowner of the company's own factory and jurisdiction. And if they wanted to expand their presence or their rights, they had to effectively negotiate with Fleetwood as the local Golconda authority of the region. Now, as his family grows, his territory prospers, his transnational kind of bailiwick increases, and his business relationships with Asian elites intensifies. He negotiates with the Sultan for the grant of neighbouring towns. For example, in 1675, he, quote, contracted with the king of Golconda for the town and several lands around Narsapura. So his fiefdom is growing, nestled in the Godavari Delta and sustained through the patronage and capital of his cross-cultural networks. Fleetwood's jurisdiction was a hybrid political construct, born out of his duality as the English chief, East India Company chief, and a regional Golconda official. And his growing influence and the fact that he was obliged, quote, obliged to pay a great sum of money yearly to the Golconda king. This gave him access to the Sultan's court and the corridors of power in Golconda. And when the Sultan Abdul Hassan toured the Delta in 1678, he chose to stay with Fleetwood and his family in their fair great house, as he called it, a palatial brick structure surrounded by ornate gardens. Now, when word gets back to Madras and London of Fleetwood's private empire building, an investigation is launched in 1678. But it wasn't to punish Fleetwood, but rather to see whether, quote, the whole business of the towns might tend to our profit and advantage. So when the company sent out a supervisor, he reports back to Madras that governing the towns, quote, would be much to the company's interests and advantage. And Fleetwood and Fleetwood was ordered to hand them over to the company, and he did this willingly, although he's allowed to retain the government of Narsapur on account of the fact that, quote, he could not easily remove his numerous family from there, and his retention of this little village wherein he lives would not be prejudicial to the company. So because of the private integration of an East India Company official into the Golconda state, the company was no longer a foreign visiting merchant, but a key cog in the political and economic structures of power in the region. Now, I want to sort of wrap it up here, because I'm very conscious that I've been talking now for about 45 minutes. And let me do that by, I mean, I had sort of one more topic I wanted to talk over, but I'll use that as a way to conclude. So the kind of themes of this book, looking at the way in which the expansion of the company was part of the expansion of certain Asian states and empires, looking at the way that this was not due to a national or corporate enterprise, but rather the enfranchisement of private individual company servants and their cross-cultural networks that became highly embedded in these local structures of economic and political power. How can we conceptualize this kind of expansion? If it's not predominantly military, and indeed in some parts of Asia where the company isn't operating within the jurisdiction of strong states and empires, it does resort to force and violence, and places like the west coast of Sumatra, although it has absolutely no success in doing so. Predominantly then, in Asia, it's resorting to expanding within existing frameworks of power. Now, there are multiple mechanisms that the company utilise and that Asian elites and rulers utilise to bring Europeans into the state and to regulate and transform them. And I think the best way to think about this is sort of a transnational constitutional environment where Asian elites and rulers develop a toolkit to deal with Europeans, to contain them, regulate them, and then enfranchise them. And what I was going to do over the next sort of 10 minutes is to tease some of those out. But let me just go through them very briefly as a way to sort of wrap up the talk. The key one was the Farman, which is an imperial or royal decree or order. Think of it as a written grant or charter. The company often liked to refer to farmers as their Magna Cartas. They were, in many respects, constitutional documents which laid out the privileges and rights that subordinate actors enjoyed in that state or empire. They're increasingly used by the company as a way to expand their rights. So it's a legal document. The most famous, of course, in 1717, the company succeeds in acquiring the Imperial Farman, which radically increases its territory, provides customs-free trade, and extraterritorial privileges, such as the Mughal Empire being responsible for seizing company debtors and returning them for punishment. The Farman forms the foundation of the company's expansion, especially from the 18th century. But there's also gift giving. Part of the acquisition of the Imperial Farman in 1717, for example, was a 80-ton, 140 bullock caravan which snakes its way from Calcutta to Delhi, providing the emperor with something like 200,000 rupees worth of gifts, which helped to acquire the Farman. There's also pitash, or the payment of tribute. The company, in dealing with local and national officials, engage in tributary relationships where they acquire their rights through the payment of fixed and annual tributes. And that therefore binds them and commits them to upholding the sovereignty of that tributary state. And then finally, Salabat. This is a really interesting one I'm still doing more work on, but peppered throughout the company's diplomatic correspondence is many of these mechanisms Asian states used to incorporate and then utilize the East India Company. Farmers to expand their rights, gift giving, and tribute to tie them more firmly to structures of power. Salabat was often a way for Asian elites to contain and limit the company's expansion. So when the company would apply for more rights or engage in gift giving and diplomatic conventions, they would often be denied their requests through Salabat. Mughal officials would say that everything must carry on according to Salabat, custom or precedent, and the company had no right to expand its territory or increase its trade. And there's a fantastic example, I'll end with this example, in 1688, when the Mughal Empire gobbles up the Sultanate of Golconda, and the company used that chance to try and acquire the town of Santa May. And they petition the Mughal Emperor, they send him gifts, they pay tribute, but he doesn't want the English position expanding any more than it is. So he proclaims, and let me bring the quote up here, In 1688, he proclaims that all should go on according to Salabat, and ordered that these parts should be under the same rules and government as the king at Golconda's time. So what we have here is the emergence from this process of decentralization, integration of Europeans, of a kind of transnational toolkit to regulate their presence and to enfranchise them with a set of rights, which in the case of the East India Company helps them to emerge by the mid-18th century as the largest European power in Asia. And I think I'll stop there, if that's okay.
Yes, thank you so much for that deeply fascinating, detailed, rich talk. I'm sure there are many, many themes we can potentially pick up on, and I've received a few questions from the audience so far, but I will let everybody know if you do have a question, of course, send a message to me, let me know, so we can add that to the discussion. I'll take the usual moderator's privilege to maybe kick things off with a few sort of closely interrelated questions of my own. So, if I can sort of re-summarize, especially as you were saying at the beginning, some of, I think one of the things that's so interesting about this work is the way that you challenge, on the one hand, two sort of typical ways that the historical social scientific literature has looked at these things. On the one hand, sort of European states clashing with Asian states, getting beneath the surface of that and showing the relationship so much more complicated. And also sort of on the European side, and highlighting how the tendency we have to think of states as kind of powerful centralized forces has some truth if you're looking at the 19th century, perhaps, as I heard you, has some truth if you're looking maybe at the Spanish and Portuguese empires in the Americas, but doesn't really fit, obviously, the particular period you're looking at here. So I want to pick up on that kind of decentralization theme, just to ask a few questions to drill down on it. So I think there are three. The first one is to what extent is Britain an average European state in this particular time period, or is it particularly decentralized? The second one is sort of, to put it very simply, is decentralization a source of strength or weakness? That the company seems to obviously is able to perhaps survive when it otherwise wouldn't be able to, because of that, its ability to maneuver, but at the same time you can see sort of challenges they face because of that. And the third one is, I guess sort of just continuing to extend the period forwards in time. When does it, when does the period of relative decentralization give way to something else? So start with that. And please, everyone in the audience, if you have questions, send them to me.
Thanks so much for the questions, Chris. So to start with the first question, how typical is England and later Britain? I mean that's an interesting one. I think in many respects the launch of the East India Company is a way to remedy England's relative weakness in Western Europe, and obviously the access to the Asian trade and its monopolization by the Portuguese, for example, is enough to transform that rather marginal European state into a sort of a global giant, and saddled between the Iberian powers on the one hand, then France and the Netherlands on the other. I mean, England is certainly is the weakest of the bunch. Dutch economic and financial practice is more developed and more global facing, even before they launched their own East India Company in 1602. And as previous English attempts overseas expansion has shown before the East India Company, they're in a very kind of weak and marginal position. Think about the failures of the Northwest Passage expeditions, even the big success story, excuse me, the Levant or the Muscovy companies are, are very much minor players in their particular European theatres. And if you look at the early colonization of the North Atlantic in particular, these are very very fringe attempts. So yeah, I mean, for me, England's at the bottom of the pack, and also there is not just kind of an economic and overseas weakness. There's also a kind of constitutional instability, which England is certainly not alone in the 17th century, as in that respect. But much of because of the company is constituted by the crown and linked to the powers of the crown. When obviously with the English Civil War and the emergence of a republic, the East India Company is a really weak position. So my argument would be that how can we think of the English state as capable and strong when the English state itself is largely kind of disintegrating by the mid 17th century, and that disintegration doesn't necessarily hamstring England. If you think about Cromwell's Western design, his ability to take Jamaica from the Spanish, but certainly in terms of the resources and the company could expect, it's just not there. So the English East India Company is launched in such kind of weak environment that within 20 years it's merged with its far bigger Dutch competitor. The Dutch are able to find more shipping, to create bigger stock and investment, and every market the English arrive in is sort of already dominated by the Dutch. So I mean, relatively speaking, I think the England is certainly the weakest of the bunch. Got political instability, economically it's quite marginal. Its biggest export, woolens, is not wanted anywhere. There's a slump in the trade which forces the company, when it launches, it's kind of being forced to take all of this stock and dump it overseas because traditional markets like Amsterdam are no longer sort of performing as they should. So yeah, it is a period of weakness, which is partly why trading companies are constituted, because the state itself is not able to conduct diplomacy and trade and build forts and maintain garrisons thousands of miles away. So that idea of outsourcing empire, I think it's a very pertinent one. So yes, I think it's weak, and that shows in that early history which I sketched earlier. This process of decentralization. Sorry, Chris, what was your second question? Your third one is when it sort of all comes to an end, but what was your second question?
I guess the second one is sort of, I mean, it's maybe tied up in part with what you've just been saying, but it's something along the lines of, is this, is it a source of strength or a source of weakness? Or
yeah, that's right. Thank you very much. So yes, so it looks, and this is sort of my argument, where if we want to carry on being comparative with other European enterprises in Asia, is that it looks like a serious weakness. And those powers which don't decentralize in that kind of way. So if you look at the Dutch VOC, the Dutch East India Company, it's highly centralized. Its regulatory framework is based on Batavia, which in turn answers to the 17 gentlemen in the Netherlands. Private trade is regulated and eventually banned. It's just a much tighter operation, which doesn't reflect the Dutch states, of course, that are highly decentralized. But the Dutch East India Company goes out the gate with a bang and carries on that way for much of the 17th century. But while the Dutch are busy building big expensive forts and building large fleets and seriously involved in colonization as the extermination or displacement of Southeast Asian people in places like the Banda Islands and Java, the English East India Company's weakness begins to force this process of decentralization, in which rather than relying on a kind of centralized projection of kind of military power, which is costly, at the end of the day these are supposed to be trading companies, the companies having to adapt and adopt new strategies, which seem weak by the Dutch or the Portuguese experience, but ultimately reconstitutes the company to something that's far more nimble, far more hybrid, far more flexible, and its ability to be submissive and passive and to accept the sovereignty of foreign rulers over the East India Company, which the Dutch would would rarely ever tolerate. The rare example is in Tokugawa, Japan, obviously, where the Dutch fight their gradual subordination to the Japanese regime, but they eventually do by shedding most of their extraterritorial privileges and their trading rights, and they're rewarded by being the few Europeans that are actually allowed there. But in the archipelagos of Southeast Asia and elsewhere in the Indian Ocean, the Dutch wouldn't accept that kind of subordinate position. Its resources were too big. And so while the Dutch are strutting around and colonizing and killing and monopolizing, mostly in Southeast Asia, where of course by the end of the 17th century the spice trade would be in somewhat of a decline, the English are learning to adapt and to accommodate their kind of wide range of more powerful individuals that they have to deal with. And by taking this submissive, weak position, they're able to, I think, to kind of insert themselves more easily. In a way, they're just not seen as the kind of threat, for example, the Dutch would be or the Portuguese, and they can use that to their advantage. So I think that in many respects, that what starts off as coming from a place of weakness actually helps them to insert themselves in a far less threatening way. And by the end of the 17th century, when the textile trade is more important than the spice trade, the English East India Company are inserted into all the major political and economic structures of the textile trade, from Golconda in the south to Mughal Bengal in the north, and they're poised and they're better placed to take advantage of that. So when I was, refuting this idea of expansion always being a process of centralization and the projection of force, the company's expansion is from its private servants' initiatives to accommodate its weakness and to adapt and integrate rather than try to dominate. So it definitely ends up by the early 18th century as a strength. When does this process of decentralization come to an end? Really the big kind of narrative, historiographical narrative is obviously with 1757 with the Battle of Plassey, the beginning of, this is something that Philip Stern has often highlighted, this trade to empire narrative, that the English are so, not interested in power up until they suddenly seize it in 1757, and then it's all about empire. As we know, that the company are busy governing jurisdictions and building their power, for a century and a half before that. It's just that that's done within the existing structures of power and in a way that doesn't undermine or destabilize, but in fact seeks to strengthen the authority and the power of the state it's nestled in, because its rights and privileges derive from those sovereign sources. So it's really, and if you think about the Battle of Plassey and the subsequent conquest of Bengal in 17, it still takes on the company. It takes the company a while to abandon these strategies of integration and working within the structures of the economic and political structures already in Asia. So if you think about in 1765, the company defeats a joint coalition of several prominent Nawabs or Indian kings and the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II at the Battle of Buxar. And in 1765, they've more or less got all of North India laid at their feet. They're appointed the Divani, or the revenue officer, to collect the revenue of Bengal, which is something like £2.5 million. So there's a serious the scale of power has gone way to the English East India Company, a way that it never has before. And yet, instead of shedding those structures of power, they're certainly dominating them, but they still choose to operate largely within those structures of power. By becoming the Divani, or the revenue officer of the Mughal Empire, they now have a stake or an interest in defending that Mughal framework of power, however hollowed out they make it. And this is what I was saying earlier, at this point, they do become a destabilizing presence, because that idea of expansion, that fiscal military expansion, with the expansion of the British state, that becomes more of a threat to the Asian states they're operating with. So, with the Act of Union in 1707, the kind of Anglo-Scottish state becomes, obviously the British state. The British state is a different beast to its English predecessor. It's more centralized. Its its resources are greater. Its trade's increased. its military capabilities, and the British state starts to intervene by the 18th century a lot more in Asia. So you get the appearance for the first time ever of British military forces. In Asia, it's only ever been company military forces, which are very small and weak and scattered. But following 1740s and 50s, they start to increase. So the British state directly attempts to regulate and control the East India Company's development. And in many respects, the company finds that ability to balance like Mughal interests and English interests almost impossible when the British state kind of asserts its authority in a way that the company's never really had before from its domestic setting. So I would say the later 18th century is the point in which this concept of expansion, within the Asian state system is no longer valid. But it's not a jarring break. Even by 1765, they're still awkwardly trying to operate within the system, even as in doing so, they're kind of breaking it down and hollowing it out. So I don't think we can say 1757 trade and then empire. I think it's slightly more drawn out. I think it's a process in which the company, it's always easier to cling to proven strategies than to abandon them and find new ones. And that process takes a lot of time. The consequence of that is things like the Bengal famine, and the exploitation and looting of India. But yeah.
Okay, fantastic. So I have two questions from the audience I want to pose as well, going in slightly different directions. So one is, to what extent can we see in the East India Company an early version of globalization and modern multinational companies? And the other one is asking about, you mentioned sort of, the various charters in the period, whether we can think about the relation, sort of use the term constitutional to think about the relationship between the company and local powers and so forth. But the question is, to what extent did all of that thinking about charters, relationships in the sort of overseas context, to what extent did that reflect back on debates in Britain as the, sort of those fundamental issues of how to think about public law and constitutions and so forth?
Excellent. Well, thank you for those questions. So for the first one, I mean, obviously there's kind of a rich literature about, obviously with, the advent of global history in the past couple of decades, this is where the East India Company, has kind of come into its own in many respects. But I think that especially when we look at or we kind of adopt this conceptualization of the company as something that was predominantly weak and needing to integrate into existing structures of power, then we see it kind of less as this kind of force of imperialism in this earlier part. And we can see the company, this process of decentralization in the mid-17th century opens the company up to non-European, to use a very kind of corporate term, stakeholders, right? Those people that have an interest in engaging with the company for their particular benefit or for some kind of reason. So we think of, the company's stakeholders and its authorities as, the Crown, the board of directors in London, or the English Crown, or the British Parliament by the 18th century. But actually by, forging, really intimate relationships with Indian merchants, by accepting the sovereignty of Asian rulers over the company, and by subordinating itself and acting as a vassal, the company in a way gains a whole new cast of stakeholders that can determine the company's success or failure. And that in itself, in many ways, makes the company less a vehicle for English colonialism, which we know it will become down the line. But in this earlier century or century and a half, it's more of a kind of, a vehicle for the power and agency of non-Europeans to shape English expansion overseas. And we're all obsessed with what orders are the directors giving out, what happens when the English Crown does that, and what about Parliament when it gets involved and tries to regulate the company, and Clive and Hastings and all that. And we don't pay enough attention to the kind of control and agency exercised over the company by the non-European stakeholders, the Sultan of Golconda, the Mughal Emperor, these sorts of people. And I think if we brought them into the narrative and gave them the more privileged role which they demand, because they have such a bigger impact on the company's development, as hopefully I've shown over the past sort of hour, then I think you can see the company as something that does not necessarily, does not necessarily, I'm not actually this popular, apologies. It's not something that necessarily is the projection of Europe over the non-European world, but actually is this kind of vehicle that allows Asian agency to shape the company. And therefore that in itself is a process of globalization. You take these kind of national European enterprises and they are reshaped by the forces they encounter overseas. So in the first half of this century, in the 17th century, we can call the East India Company an English enterprise, desperately attempting to uphold national interests and corporate interests. And yet by the second half of the 17th century and into the 18th century, it's no longer that. It has to uphold the interests of, Asian elites and rulers, and it has to work within Asian powers, structures of power. And therefore it's transnational corporations straddling those two worlds. And it's as I mentioned, it's a very kind of delicate balance that eventually fails by the later 18th century. But so for more than a century, it's bringing these two very different systems of power in conversation, and they're interacting. The company has to balance them, and it has to please its English stakeholders, Parliament, the Crown, and its shareholders. It has to also please its Asian stakeholders, those local elites, and those rulers that could just and do, sometimes, the Mughal Empire just kicks the East India Company out of Bengal when it's causing trouble and brings it back in on its own terms. And the company has to counter. It has to grovel to that power. It has no choice, and if it doesn't, it's gone. And the success of the English East India Company by the end of the 17th century is it does. It accommodates that cast of powerful Asian actors that. So I think we can look at the company, and sorry to use jargon, but as this kind of transnational vehicle that brings these two worlds closer together. Globalization isn't just about the exchange of goods and ideas. It's about the integration of these political systems before empire. I hate using that term, but I'm talking before those territorial conquests. And I don't think we've got a proper narrative or lexicon or conceptualization of what that is yet. We call it pre-colonial, right? That's just such a horrible phrase, and it just flattens the agency and the complexity of this period. But if we look at the history of the East India Company in this way, I think it gives us a better window into how to understand that. And it's not always positive, obviously, as we know. And the company's expansion, which seems like a success story, is obviously also a massively tragic and destabilizing one by the end of the 18th century. And in some ways, that kind of ties into the second question about. Sorry, Chris, remind me, was that about this idea of constitutional?
About the sort of the different charters that were granted, the different ways the state interacted with the British East India Company, the kind of other sort of structuring of relationships with local powers, and how those fed back into sort of all of the debates in the UK at the time, or vice versa. Actually, I'll also flag for my own part in that regard. You mentioned at one point in your talk the company being described as a body without a head. I think like a monster, something like that, which really, for me, is very reminiscent of sort of a lot of pejorative critiques of democracy or that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So just,
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, to answer that question massively. So, and it relates to my point earlier, where the company is reconstituted as more of this kind of European Asian hybrid, having to serve the interests of both worlds. Then, naturally, that feeds back into its domestic European context. I mean, there's work being done on this. I touch on it slightly in my book, but William Pescu, for example, is looking at this more detail. And I was part of a big project that looked at the way in which the English Constitution was shaped by England's kind of overseas interaction. So if you think about debates around, for example, the prerogative powers of the Crown in England, and the company was often drawn into these debates because as a monopoly, that was part of a royal prerogative to grant. So when the company would, for example, declare war in Asia or conquer territory or conduct diplomacy that had to be delegated by the English Crown, which is the genesis of these Crown charters. Technically, they couldn't do anything in Asia unless it was in their English charter that was granted by the English Crown. But the thing is, it does, driven by individuals and their networks and not by London. The company is regularly, engaging in war, whether it's defending its territory or otherwise. It's raising taxes and it's engaging in diplomacy that is often very anti-national, that's not in English interests, but it's in the interests of those immediate individuals and their networks. A really good example is, excuse me, is in 1686. The company's factory at Hooghly in Bengal gets into conflict with the Mughal garrison, and then the port partly catches on fire, and the English are, as a result, kind of expelled from Bengal for this. And over the next few years, the company in London, detached from the realities of what it takes to succeed in Asia, integrating and playing nice, send out several fleets. They've never done this before. Several ships, a big fleet, to take back Hooghly. The company servants, when this fleet arrives, well, we can't go to war with the Mughal Empire. That's completely stupid. What we might be able to do is capture Mughal shipping and make a fuss, and maybe they'll bring us back on terms previously. And that's what happens. They don't use the warships or the troops that are sent out. The company servants they engage in all these various diplomatic and legal mechanisms to be brought back into Bengal, and they are in 1690. But they're not granted a farmland because obviously they've been too naughty. So all they can do is trade. They can't even build in brick. They can only build in timber and mud. This sparks a constitutional crisis back in Britain about the role of the company and its failure, and that it's not upholding English interests, and it's humiliating, and it's engaging in too much diplomacy, and it's subordinating itself. And there's a real kind of public pamphlet battle. Some of them sort of say, even Madras is rented from the King of Golconda. We see the kind of awareness in the public sphere, although I'm sure partly on behalf of interested parties, of knowledge that the company is very much a vassal to some of these Asian states. It's very un-English. The debate rages, and it sparks a debate about the Crown's ability to grant monopolies, and a debate between free trade and monopolies. And in 1698, as a direct result of the company's refusal to fight the Mughal Empire and instead go back groveling and reinsert itself into the state there, the company, the King William III, launches his own company, and there's a kind of constitutional crisis as these two East India companies coexist and battle it out, and Parliament get involved, because following the Glorious Revolution, of course, Parliament is seeking to expand its authority over the Crown, and vice versa. So exactly how the company operates, and this way it operates very submissively and subordinately in order to expand, is seen as going against English interests. And following that brief conflict with the Mughal Empire in 1686, it directly triggers this kind of constitutional conflict at home about the rights of the king, the rights of Parliament, and the need to uphold English interest overseas. So definitely, and that's one way we can see Asian agency. We often think about colonialism as being one way from Europe to Asia or elsewhere, but we have Asian agency directly interacting with key constitutional domestic debates and events in England. So we can't just think of it as being projected one way. The power of and the importance of Asia in this period is directly feeding and reshaping the English domestic context, maybe indirectly, but it's still there. So the East India Company, it's not just that vehicle that brings these two worlds into great dialogue, but it's often a vehicle in which the world of Asia can directly affect domestic political development. So it's fascinating. Work's being done on that. But so your answer to that is yeah, absolutely.
Okay, fantastic. Well, I'm sure I could keep you here all day with questions, because it's absolutely fascinating. But I think we've in fact already gone a little bit over our allotted time. So thank you so much for sticking with us.